Your attendance. Let's start off with apologies.
We haven't had any apologies. Councillor Roberts is unable to attend in person, but is hoping to join remotely. Councillor Beasley is joining remotely as well.
We had an email from Councillor Wolf a few weeks back saying that he might not be attending meetings until the autumn. But I think probably should record that as being his apologies unless he communicates otherwise. I'd also like to welcome Councillor Rice back to our committee, having seen you before, and good to see you here. Thank you very much. Good morning, John. Thank you.
Morning, Chairman. Apologies not to be with you. It just became impossible, I'm afraid.
All right. Okay. Moving on to the minutes of the meeting held on Tuesday, the 14th of March. Does anybody have any issue with the factual accuracy of the minutes? No, in which case I will sign them at the end of the meeting. Do we have any declarations of interest? No. we have public participation?
We've had no questions, Chairman.
Okay.
From the public.
Questions from councillors?
We've had no questions from the council.
Okay. Any urgent items?
No urgent items have been raised to me.
Okay, thank you. Are the Green people?
They're not in the waiting room.
Okay.
You want?
Well, what I suggest is we go on to
the next
item 8, the investment strategy review.
Yeah.
So if you want to introduce that, David, and then we'll slightly alter things.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Chairman. So, David Works, Service Manager for Treasury and Investments at Dorset Council. So, following the conclusion of the latest triennial actuarial valuation of pension funds' assets and liabilities, we engaged investment consultants Mercer to review our pension fund investment strategy. The conclusions that Mercer came to was that our current investment strategy is relatively efficient and with no compelling reasons to make changes, and that the training session that was held yesterday for committee members, Mercer went into the detail explaining their reasoning for reaching that conclusion. They were also supportive of the current policy we have, which is to hedge 50% of the pension fund's investment foreign currency exposure across its global equities investments. So the main purpose of today's report is seeking approval of the high-level asset allocation based on actuals as at 31st of March 2023, which is set out in the table in paragraph 1.1 of the report. Once we have agreement of this high-level strategy, then there are a number of more detailed areas which were highlighted in the report and also discussed yesterday that we will come back to at forthcoming training sessions and meetings. And those items primarily were a review of the mix of the pension fund's equity investments, see whether there's any scope for rationalisation of that, looking at affordable housing to see we do have some relatively small exposure to affordable housing through our mandate with CBRE property, but to see whether there's a case for increasing an allocation to affordable housing within our overall property allocation. Reconsidering private debt as an asset class was another area that was highlighted. And also reviewing the rebalancing policy. So looking at the parameters around our allocations to different asset classes and ensuring that we've got a robust rebalancing policy that's not too tight, but that is enforced. So that's something active. So that's something that we would do again. And also there was discussion yesterday. There's less about it in the report, but there's discussion yesterday about the pension fund's pathway to net zero in terms of decarbonisation. So, Chairman, that was all I wanted to say. I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to add.
Yeah. I think the important thing of what we want to achieve today is primarily to agree the overarching strategy, the balance between equities and fixed income and other major asset classes, and then spend the next couple of meetings going into detailed analysis of exactly what we want to do in terms of things like the move to net zero, and also how we can go about rationalising some of the funds, because we do seem to have a lot of funds compared to the other LGPS pension funds. Part of them are a side effect of the changes we brought about concerning the inflation hedging and the unwinding of that position. But we certainly do need to have a significant number of funds who perhaps overlap with each other a bit too much, and we want to sort of spend some real time analysing what the best way forward. Steve, did you want to fill members in particular, those who couldn't make it yesterday?
Yeah, well, I think you've sort of summarised it really. The changes that were made last year when we sold the LDI and when we moved into equities and corporate bonds and MAC were quite significant. We talked about that quite a lot at the time, as you recall. They were the right changes. Actually, ironically, Mercer kind of coming to the conclusion now that actually that was a good move in terms of our probability of meeting our target. So that's quite pleasing. That was significant. So really, the conclusion of yesterday's presentation was that not too much needed to do in terms of the overarching strategy. It was more in terms of kind of the detail underneath. So that was quite a reasonable outcome, actually.
Yeah. Does anybody have any questions or anything else they want to say in particular? Howard.
More a statement than a question, I think, if that's all right. Because I'm looking at the recommendations here. And I was actually impressed with Mercer's review, which is in this agenda, but we had it yesterday as well. And I thought for a change, I thought that they were more interested in us than they might be, as some commercial organisations are in themselves. I'm not blaming them for anything, by the way. I'm always suspicious of advisors. But start off with that, but I was very happy with them. And I like it that here, the second recommendation, agree a further review with regard or involving the Mercer recommendations yesterday. Is about it. I wouldn't necessarily do anything because of Mercer yesterday, because I think it was steady as she goes, but watch out for these areas is probably a better way of doing it. And this investment review I'd go along with. Sometimes I think it should be continuous anyway. It shouldn't be just what we do it at different stages. So say I was rather taken with Mercer's report yesterday. So that's a change for me.
Good. I mean, when I first saw their proposals as well, I thought, well, it's interesting. It's been a lot of time really thinking this through, looking at all alternatives, and it comes to the conclusion that broadly speaking, we're doing the right things currently and the right things going forward. So that is a good justification for what we've been doing. I suppose there's always a tendency to feel that we must do something for the sake of being seen to do something, but this is one of those cases where we really don't need to do anything, and not at the strategic level anyway. And we'll take from there. Wow.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I couldn't attend the presentation from us as yesterday, but I did read through the and I think I'm quite pleased with what they've come back with. I just had one question, and you mentioned it in the preamble about the potential idea number 4 about affordable housing from attractive asset class. I know that's probably something that we'll look at in more detail, but just about whether that be just affordable housing wherever it was, or whether focus on the area covered by this pension fund, the area whether directly or through whether we could look at supporting our own housing developments in this.
Yeah, the answer, I mean, the training that we need a couple of types of training. One is we should look at what Brunel's done in Cornwall, and where they've I've forgotten the name of the manager that set that up with them, but we can easily get or access that information. In fact, we can ask Brunel when they come to the meeting actually what they've done in Cornwall, but we need to go into that in quite a bit of detail actually, not just 5 minutes. So that's one area of training. The other thing that CBRE have an affordable housing fund, and they said, we asked them yesterday briefly about affordable housing, and they said, yeah, we can come and this is what we do, very high level, but we could come and talk to you about that. So that's another sort of source of training. Or we can ask one of the consultants, like Mercer or somebody else, to do it kind of independently. So, I'd be supportive of that discussion. I think that'd be quite interesting to look at. Obviously, every investment needs to hold its head in terms of the expected return. So it would be nice to do something that's has beneficial effects for the kind of community as well.
Just to add to that, I think it was interesting. I had caught some of the CBRE sort of care side of things, complex care, but it's interesting about sort of hybrid between affordable housing and then there's extra care housing, which is a lot of certainly BC care housing structure. Incredibly ambitious, about 300 units. The aim is to have over 1,000 extra care housing by 2030. So it's a building program going in. So yeah, I was interested to hear CBRE said to care a bit, but there's a sort of media bit that they might have to. But yeah.
Yeah, I think that they're trying to build portfolio based on their strengths. CBRE are primarily a property company rather than a care company, and I think that it's fair to say that's why they're moving in that direction. Plus, they see a demand for it, LGPS.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's all part of the kind of level, it's all part of the levelling up agenda. I mean, there are a couple of things that we need to be wary of as we investigate it. One is whether there is any implicit link to residential house prices. That's because obviously residential house prices domestic home prices are quite high at the moment, so that's one thing that we account for. And the other thing is a topic that was kind of touched on yesterday is any kind of moral hazard aspects of any investment of that type. You get trapped in a situation where there's some kind of conflict between financial return and doing the right thing for the tenants of these houses. I mean, those are the two things that I shall be along the way looking out for.
Anybody else? Any questions? No? In which case, we're all happy with the recommendations that on the paper. Yeah. See, show of hands. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Excellent. Thank you. We are having some technical issues, I think, we're getting through to Brunel, and so we'll just carry on for the time being with the other items. So item 9, the pension administrator report. So Karen, over to you.
Start off with the key performance indicators. These are improving month on month, monitored quarterly. And I'm really pleased in that fact we had new staff, you'll remember staff, and they're proving to be excellent, absolutely excellent. So, for example, deferred benefits, which aren't necessarily listed in the KPIs that you see, you may have that fell behind when, and they literally have cleared over 3,000 of these. A little bit of a problem, we don't have so many people able to check them at the high level, but that's also being resolved. And over 900 have checked in the last 2 months. So things are really moving on. I think this will set us up really well for McLeod. I'm always thinking about McLeod. There's going to be a lot of extra work over the next few years. So it is a huge importance that we get good staff in, that they're happy, their skills trained up. So all is moving well in that area. The only area that hasn't improved is certain transfers which are non-urgent because there's no impact in them. Has anyone got any questions on that before I go on?
The only one I picked up was pension forecasts. Is that a lower rating in terms of risk? Estimates.
Yes, business estimates do impact members. What has happened, fortunately, probably happened that revaluation is in fact just that means that there were some delays and some workarounds on estimates. There was a huge problem getting estimates. So this is where we've moved past the 1st of April. Contributions and pay for that each year. That takes quite a long time. So there was a lot of work around. So we had a definite issue because of that. And I think it will happen in April. But I've seen it's all picked up again. Back to that revaluation being, which has only just happened in the past week.
Right. So is that something to do with the software provider, or is it just the actual mechanism whereby information is provided at a point source coming up to the first?
As soon as you get to that stage,
yep.
We have information then coming in, and that has to be applied. So that takes so it's a little bit hit and miss, and the revaluation has to. It becomes a bit muddly, and the new system that we've got advantages, but where it's so complex, the work around time consuming.
Yeah.
So that impacted estimates, but There's a clear and understanding for that, but couldn't really be avoided because I don't think we.
No, and McLeod is going to take preference.
Yes, I think it's just how it works at that time of the year, quite difficult getting that gone, and only processes data are very good. So I don't think there's anything we can do there. It's just a massive task.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the next item here is changing the evaluation date. I did mention that last time, but just to let you know that the regulations have gone through for that. If you want more details, that is in the last report. But just to say that's another thing that's created some additional work in the team. Biggest effect is on the annual allowance. So we haven't started our annual allowance processes yet. Software providers are hopefully going to put in place the changes we need to make sure that we can do those calculations accurately, which we hope that they will. Item 4 is the scape rate change. So the government published had a consultation about the scape rate. It changed its methodology. This impacts the non-funded public sector scheme because it's what determines contributions for those schemes. For the LGPS, obviously it doesn't impact the contributions, but it does impact the factors that we use in our calculations. And as a result of that, a lot of calculations, even retirement calculations, are impacted. We have been told to suspend certain transfers. So not all transfers, because it depends what type of transfer they are and what relevant dates there is. And also refunds have had to be suspended. So this is going to create a further backlog of work for us to have to address in the future while we wait for the first tranche of those new factors has come through. The thing to be aware of, obviously, is this is going to cause problems to our workflow. The thing that's been highlighted nationally from this is CCTVs for divorce. So when somebody goes through divorce, their assets, including their pensions, have to be, and that information has to go to court, and there's strict timescales for provision of that data. It's causing problems because people are not being able to make that court order to provide information in the news about the NHS and teachers' pension schemes. It applies equally to all public sector schemes. At the moment, we've only got a few that are in this situation, but it can impact things like that divorce moving forward, people being able to sell properties. So there has been an impact on that. The pensions dashboard, I'll keep that on our radar each quarter just to let you know the progress of that. There was delays, as I mentioned before, deadlines. But in actual fact, we've just heard just recently that there's been an announcement that there's now going to be one connection date or one deadline for connection. So this has just come through, which will be the next. However, obviously not everyone can onboard on the day before, and there will be guidelines issued for schemes to onboard previously and connect. Here, I should imagine. Working on that. And even for a scheme like the LGPS, we're looking at 89 funds needing to connect to the dashboard. So it will be quite tricky at that time. So we are still continuing the work. We were continuing in regards to the dashboard, which is mainly in. We haven't as yet settled on an ISP provider. The cost of this coming out is quite large. And we are obviously making sure our data is prepared. Our data is good anyway, but we are making sure and having discussions about things like the maximum criteria. So that work is continuing, and we have now got confirmation of. One other thing that's been raised just nationally, meetings on Friday, is to do with ABCs. So where the ABCs are connected to schemes such as ours, we will display that data. That fund do have some old residual funds as well. With another ABC, but that's one, and there you know that's going to be an added complexity won't affect other public sector schemes whose agencies are much more separate than ours. They will be provided separately. So that's an additional consideration and more work coming dashboard. What is really more imminent, of course, is in cloud, item 6. As I mentioned before, we are working with Aon as our project manager. Their expertise in this area is excellent. We're getting through some first software systems and identify, for example, the members in scope. But not everybody in the scope or revised and extended underpin. We calculate that there'll be just under 18,000 members in scope for rectification. So in terms of the cloud, there'll be changing processes, and there will be rectification work for all that has been done. So that's a huge work program, and we're working very closely with AR. They are very good looking at things that you would imagine, oversight, risks, etc. And there will be regular meetings, and somebody will be mention board and the project manager so that they have oversight to our work in that. But a lot of work to do prior to the rectification. The regulations won't come in until October. Up until that point, we're data work. But the data work we're looking at when the care scheme came in, it was no longer necessary to record our changes in service breaks. Those were essential pre-2014 and the final salary scheme. Because of the cloud, we're now having to go back to employers and saying, actually, you do need all your hour changes and your service breaks from 2014. And the provision of this data is very mixed. Some employers have been able to provide it. Some employers no longer even exist. Employers change payroll providers, and some employers are just not syndicated. So the Scheme Advisory Board has guided what to do when there's data gaps, etc. Ultimately, if an employer hasn't provided accurate data, it means that there's more liabilities on the general side. So we're working on that. We'll be working on that data. Is this accurate? We're looking at communication so that members are in. This is always quite tricky. The LGPS, unlike members, will benefit from the cloud, which is quite different. Access to cloud is much greater. So, for example, in a lot of public sector schemes, they've kept their legacy schemes and elect to go into their previous. That's not happening in the LGPS. For the LGPS, there will be but it has to be done. Challenges. So part of our communication is managing member expectations, and we're not thinking about and saying, have we done this? It would take us years. Rectification probably very few people. Rectification work itself will be vast, and I'll keep you informed as we go and get more details. But it will be revisiting transfers, retirement benefits, etc. There will also be specialist work. So, and we will also be producing a policy of what decisions we've made in terms to the data and the rectification process. And I'll keep that. So we've got some provisional figures. So for example, the number of pensioners in scope is about 5,500. That means revisiting 5,500. We're hoping a lot that will have to be case, and the number of deaths that we would revisit, which we probably do just next year. So, so all in all, there is about 15,000 cases. Some will be easier to do, others. So that's on McLeod. There's new legislation coming in. The legislation covers things like the ability for us to pay compensation and interest, for example, is not currently in there. And there's a consultation at the moment looking at some technical areas, and we will be responding to that because we're now getting down to quite important nitty-gritty. For example, there's been a big change from previous draft regulations on application. There's a lot to be considered in regards to public sector as well. And how that relationship works is going to be quite difficult to manage because you have to have been in a public sector scheme. So if you've joined the LGPS, how do you know features of HSC? So there's a lot of work that will have to work, sometimes with communication as well in regard to that. There's also going to be multiple underpin dates. So it's not going to be one date, there'll be multiple things like flexible. As well, of course, I think I've mentioned before, that a lot of teachers will now retrospectively come to the LGPS on casual jobs that they had in addition to their full-time jobs. So I'll keep you updated in terms of McLeod. I'll be doing a presentation to the local board on McLeod as a starting point. So if anybody is keen on McLeod, just let me know. You'll be more welcome to. We'll keep it updated. Any questions on McLeod at the moment? A wrap up from the overseas existence sexual the affecting our pensioners. Sure that we are paying the pension for people. That has now concluded. The outcome of that is mentioned here. Is that there's a lot more people pensions received this time than 2017. That's obviously because of the pandemic and difficulties caused by the pandemic. So although I mentioned here that 3 members were reported, actually there were 8 members that found out were, but 3 of those we were contacted family members from some pension. In addition to those deceased members that we know about, there's a lot of people who didn't respond to pensions suspended, and that's a further 18 pensions, and they will remain suspended for a year, after which we will have to assume that they so in all, the amount of money that we save from that far outweighs the cost of the project. Revisit that again.
That topic is there's 12 months. You assume, if you haven't heard anything, that they're then deceased, and therefore you stop paying their benefits.
They're already deceased now, so they're suspended now. So people that didn't factor, we gave them a deadline and said if you don't respond, we sent numerous correspondence. What happens when you suspend those pensions, and there was a lot suspended, say there was 40 or 50, is the stopping of that payment prompts people to get in touch. So the 18 that are left means there's now not been pension paid for a couple of months, and no one's got in touch with us. So what happened last time is I think we had 9 of those 18, but those 9 cases have remained. It's really hard to close a record down when you don't have a date of death and you don't know the outcome. But we suspend the pension when.
So you make an assumption, which after 12 months, what happens if you get further evidence that they're either still alive and should have received a pension, or they died a long time ago and due to pay back, and that comes after that 12 months? How long can you go on for to either reclaim or have to repay of what hasn't been paid?
We wouldn't reclaim, we can't reclaim, we'll be able to reclaim from 3 factors. But the other 5 that we know are deceased, either they've told us or something like that, if we can't find a family member, and in terms of somebody were to then come or something, and we would simply pay back pay. So it's not a problem paying someone back daily pension if they don't like to be alive or well. But covering overpayments overseas, very difficult. which is why we do this exercise.
Is there any pattern about where in the world these people is it evenly spread across many different countries, or are there particular places where there's more issue?
I don't think there's a particular place that proved particularly difficult, but it is really difficult. And I mean, that's quite good that we managed to get overpaid pensions back from really families who obviously hadn't contacted us before. And I think those overpayments we're looking at quite a few months that people didn't. But the fact that we've suspended those 18 pensions, someone claims a pension if they're entitled to it. If not, those pensions will be paid.
Clearly, we have to take strong action on this, because if we did nothing, it would just the numbers would just increase, wouldn't they? And the money's got, one does wonder where the money's gone. But maybe right family members or whether criminal gangs, even that sort of thing, bully people into making payments over to them or something like that. I mean, it's hard to know, isn't it? But I'm genuinely surprised that the numbers are worse now than they were when we first did this, because one thought they would improve over time, not get worse.
It's in this country, it's quite different, and it may be that there are some countries, but if we make a payment to a bank account for somebody who's deceased, the bank won't accept that payment, and it comes back. But obviously, this isn't happening in other countries around the world. The payments are going. I mean, we will be notified, and a lot of people are obviously very good at notifying us, family members that deal with the state. There's a lot of normality in amongst it that we won't know about. It is just very different, just to reassure you, in the UK. Not only do we have health once, but we do monthly mortality checks, which are checks against the register of death. So it's a really good process in the UK. We have under 500 pensioners living abroad, so it's huge. Item 9 just covered.
So can't be good.
Thank you very much indeed, Chairman. I'm afraid the sound's quite intermittent this morning, so I only get snatches of what's being said, but I think I've got the gist of it. And just a quick couple of points. I think committee should be reassured over the assurance, really, of the overseas existence checks that that Karen and her team are undertaking. We've looked at this before, and I think actually that assurance is in place, Chairman. My question really was whether, particularly around McLeod, but around some other issues, Karen and her team are getting the help and support and timely input from the Scheme Advisory Board to help formulate the way forward, because I know it's been a bit patchy in the past, and I'd just like to know that actually that has improved, and that if there are any further improvements, I'm more than happy to help take those up on behalf of Karen, the team, and Dorset. But probably if they apply to us, they apply more generally. And I just wondered whether I could have a response to that, and if I can do anything, then I'll do my best to do so.
Thanks, John. I appreciate that. And we're certainly aware of the Scheme Advisory Board guided our missing data, which we will be looking at. But I don't think there's anything necessarily that's cropped up at the moment. I'm on the technical group, and there's a lot there in discussion about McLeod, and I'm sure they'll go to the Scheme Advisory Board. It tends to be where there's legal issues, and I think there's difficulties around legal matters, certainly differences in opinions and approaches that the Scheme Advisory Board is useful to schemes. It is really important to have a consistent approach, I think, nationally, to something as significant as McLeod.
Any other questions? No. And so
about administration. Yeah, I've got a question.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Can I just raise a subject? I just mentioned it to Karen just before, actually, which is that cyber risk. So I don't know to what extent you're aware of it, but you can Google it on the BBC website. If you Google cyber risk capita breach. So this is the regulator is very, very hot on cyber risk at the moment. In fact, one of my other pension funds were having training this coming Thursday from our administrator on their cyber preparedness. And the reason I mention this story of Capita is that what has happened in this case is that Capita, which is a big administrator, is on the national framework for LPPS actually, and is a big administrator for the private sector, has had a breach of its security. The talk on the street is that it came about through an employee in Capita, India, clicking on a phishing email, and that opens the access to cyber criminals to get hold of hundreds of thousands of personal data across all sorts of schemes in the UK, including personal details, national insurance numbers. I'm not sure whether they got bank details, and those details apparently are currently for sale on the internet, the dark web, wherever criminals buy those things. So this is a really big topical issue for pension funds, I think. So I think it's a kind of fair, I don't know what, in terms of governance, you know, the pension committee, the pension board, the council itself, which is the kind of overarching cyber protection. But I think it's I think it's something that the pension committee might want to kind of understand, you know, about our own cyber protection, because it's a position that we never want to be, you know, we never want to get into.
You check everybody in here. So from a council systems perspective, generally from Dorset Council system, cyber is something we take very, very seriously, sort of right at the top of our risk register.
Yeah.
And we've been involved over the last year or two on piloting LGA peer reviews of the cyber, our approach to resisting cyber attacks. So we're well aware, but the risk is out there. You know, if Capita is vulnerable, then I'm sure Dorset Council is. So from a political governance perspective, we've briefed the audit committee a year or so ago. We make sure those briefings are done in private, so we don't expose any frailties or otherwise, and be more than willing to provide a briefing here from our IT team, who have got a good story to tell, but we're not complacent. I think the vulnerability you say these phishing attacks is something we're acutely aware of as well, and all staff, as part of their mandatory training, all staff in the Dorset Council systems are required to do regular cyber training, and that's something we try and enforce. Regarding Capita as well, we've been in conversation with Capita, not least through our reviews, and Dorset Capita notified us of the breach that they'd had globally, so we're in conversation there with them. But I think the main point, it's a risk to anywhere, isn't it?
Yeah.
It is a risk to Dorset Council. We take it very seriously.
Yeah.
The committee would welcome a brief.
That makes sense. Yeah, it's got very close time, and I don't know how public it is being built down. And I don't know that Thomas Hardy School in Dorset has effectively had no IT for several months now, because they've completely crashed, and won't be fully operational again until well into September, I'm told. I also heard a report about the Capita situation where apparently usually what happens is that the criminal, if you want your data back or security, you have to get in contact with the criminals and negotiate the price of something. Yeah. But they've issued apparently this demand which says that because of the Capita's links with so many different companies, they haven't got time. The criminals haven't got time to contact the people, and they say you've got to contact us. But they're so confident they're reversing it around and saying you've got to contact us, or else we won't even attempt to fix your system, and you'll completely be unable to use your IT systems, basically. This is a horrendous problem. I think it's just so easy in some respects for people to perfectly honestly make that mistake, and you go so much training as possible, but at the end of the day, it relies on the gut instinct almost, right? So saying, well, this looks a bit fishy, so I'm just going to delete it. I'm not going to go anywhere near it, and that's probably the single most best thing. If in doubt, don't go anywhere near it. But it's a real problem.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether you perhaps we could ask some of the people who are employees of Dorset Council whether you personally receive penetration test emails. So this would be, it looks like a regular email. You get it, you click on it. You shouldn't have clicked on it because it wasn't a regular, it wasn't really from who it was from. And then you're sent to train. You're automatic. If you have clicked on it, your IT department can consider your training. you do it twice or three times, you're you're or whatever. So I mean, that's that's in any organisation, these are the questions I'll be asking on Thursday. That sort of thing should be happening.
I can confirm that we do that. Most recently, we ran a test of a spurious click here to see your pay slip.
Yeah,
and so we've got some interesting results, which I will. So in terms of an action point, the next time we do some training, if that's soon enough, could we set aside an hour and I'll invite the IT team to give us a briefing of where we're at?
Yeah,
that's
good. I'm sure it'll help people's minds at that. Yeah, definitely.
Just anecdotally, I am a member of staff, and I have received that style of email going through, and I am asked every month to undertake another module of training which relates to it. So,
any other questions on that? No?
Yeah, hang on a minute. So I've just mentioned this big budget. Recently, everyone allowed 60,000. Stopping of LTA charges and then the life. So there was a few sort of changes back from that budget. Item 10, I wanted to mention to you.
Presumably the changes in lifetime allowance don't actually affect the fund. It just changes whether the government gets some of the money and the member gets some of the money. Is that right?
That's right. So it's not necessarily going to affect the fund, but it will affect members.
Yeah.
And we obviously deal with these tax charges.
Yeah.
So it should mean a bit less work for us going forward. The 23 tax year, which we're about to do the annual allowance process, are unchanged. Next year there will be an increase. It means we don't have to calculate lifetime allowance charges anymore. We don't get many lifetime allowance charges in.
No.
I've mentioned the death fund policy changes to make you aware that this is a very difficult area for the LGS and for funds to have a discretion over death fund. This discussion can lead to some issues, and there have been issues, not this fund, but with other funds nationally, that we've been made aware of. As a result of this, we're changing slightly how our approach to the payment of death grants, taking more legal advice than we used to. In part, the increase in legal advice has come through the complexities which seem to be over family affairs and family dynamics. And also, we think there's a lot of financial pressure on people. We're having a lot of issues with payment of death grant. So we're changing our approach slightly and working with our lawyer to develop a policy that we hope will give the fund some protection. And we're adding this to the risk register because it is a risk that we don't exercise our discretion correctly and fully. That could impact the fund and its reputation. But at the moment, we haven't had any such issues, but there are some nationally that we're aware of. So just to let you know that there's some work involved. Does anyone have any questions?
Just to check, so this is where members die, but there's no sort of expression of wish about what they're either married or there's no expression of wish up to who residual sum should go. So that's left to his discretion to decide.
Yes, and it's what's complicated in a way is that expression of wish because it's not legally binding. And I think we always used to say actually that if there's an expression of wish and it was up to date and it was reasonable, so for example, if somebody nominated they had since divorced, we would say that was reasonable reason to ignore that expression of wish. What's happened now is we have to question the expression of wish, inquiries into families, and almost invite comment. In other words, the expression of wish we have to take as a piece of evidence, but not necessarily follow it in the same way as we would have done before. We just have to be much more cautious in our approach. We're sending out questionnaires to family members, getting in a lot more evidence that we didn't before, and considering that evidence even if and where there is so that we go through the process of using that discretion to make sure it's properly exercised. So the expression of wish is a useful thing, but it's not, it doesn't have any legal weight in a way. We still have overall discretion, so we can use it as an indication, but we don't have to follow it. We're just really running in a lot of caution because cases up to where they've been extremely difficult for authorities to deal with.
Unfortunately, I think it's sort of which can generate very negative publicity if people, ourselves or other authorities, are perceived to be doing things which are unfair, driven by the moral values of different groups and that sort of thing. It is potentially a bit of a minefield, isn't it? I mean, because if you just say, "Oh, in principle, we'll pay the money," that keeps everybody very quiet and reasonably happy. But every now and again, there's still going to be somebody jumping up and down saying, I really should be having the money and not so and so should be having the money. Go to the media and the press and generate this story. It can be very, very reputationally damaging for us.
And financially damaging, reputational. It's a very sensitive area. And the last thing you want to do with bereaved families is really send them an intrusive questionnaire. So we've always not tiptoed around it before, but now we are being a little bit more cautious in every respect. We may be being over cautious, to be fair, but we are really just being a lot more cautious in how we, in our processes of paying death. When it comes to basis benefits, they're not discretionary.
Can I just ask a question on that, which might be helpful? Who at the end of the day makes the final decision on that? What group of people, and are they adequately supported in making it?
Yes, I mean, death is a specialist area, so we don't have all many staff dealing with death first off, so they tend to be more senior staff. Happily, most cases are straightforward, so on the whole, it's fine, and there will always be senior management that signs off. If anything is slightly more contentious, or if there's not an expression of wish to come to me, and I get all the very difficult cases there as well. And if anything we feel needs something further, then we pass it to agent and piece. So we've just brought in a lot of
how many get as far
layers.
as requiring it?
Maybe 1 or 2 a year,
Right.
in terms of the contentious ones, and they really are contentious.
But that's the process.
So presumably what you would do is that you would look to see if the executors have placed a Section 27 notice of Trustee Act 1925, and then if it was a question of contentious probate, to take matters from there, i.e. if you had a claim from various relatives, etc., children who were disengaged from the deceased but putting in it an estoppel claim. Is that what you're saying?
It's difficult. There isn't necessarily a direct connection to the will, although we will ask for the will. So the reason expression of wishes are in existence is because if
binding.
does that, it means it's tax free. So it avoids inheritance tax. So it's completely separate. Whatever might be in the will doesn't cover this. That doesn't stop us though, as part of our fact finding, asking for will. And that's something that we but yeah, you know, you're right, there's an awful lot.
You'd look at all of that as part of your fact finding.
Yes. It's quite time consuming, but I think it's given us a bit more peace of mind really, just to avoid potentials.
Just thinking, a lot of people now particularly got a lot of different jobs during their careers and probably got lots of different pension pots. So in terms of if it's a member of our pension scheme, you know, you're having to do that work, I imagine there might be several other pension schemes also having to work through those sort of, do we have any sort of networking with other pension schemes so that you all come to a consistent decision? Because I can imagine it'd be quite contentious if we said, okay, well, this is the way we're going. But then the other pension schemes say, well, we're going this way, we're going this way, they get.
It would be interesting. We don't, and that may be that their regulations are different. So this is a discretion in our regulation. I looked at the NHS recently, and they were much more hard line. They wanted a nomination that they would follow that nomination regardless. You actually had to do another form to stop that nomination if your status changed. Well, we thought there's no, people just don't think of these things. They just don't think. So just thought that's too hard line. That's going to lead to more problems. So yeah, so I think it would be complex. I mean, DC schemes will be different again. Our ABC provider has a different approach because those funds have to go through the estates. So it's all a bit slightly different. But I think there's nothing to stop somebody bringing forward something if it's relevant. That's part of evidence to.
So just to conclude, you've recognised the risk. You've now put that risk on the risk register, and that will automatically be looked at annually.
The risk register goes to every board.
Yes.
So it's always reviewed there. So
yes.
The local pension there. And we have started changing processes.
Yes.
Into a policy which and because there are other issues around payment of death benefit need to include. So, for example, death grants to children and particularly for children who are very young and you want to try place to make sure that child has that money. So that there are lots of things that we need to already put in some change to realise it is.
Lovely. So the two primary risks are reputational and financial,
yes.
And those are both recognised.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Any more on that one before we move on? I wanted to let you know about our end of year processes because these are exceptionally important to the fund. This is where annually employees tell us all the data that we need. So under the care scheme, pension is calculated on an annual basis, an amount of pension per year. There's put in a few figures for you there. So the amount of employees, active care members who had care posted was 24,000. The care pay posted 502 million pounds. So that amount of money has to be accurately recorded. If it has not jobs, then accordingly. We have about 5,700 queries, which goes back to the process of the census of return, then post it, then there's a lot of queries transferred, etc. Queries within, making sure give us in terms of care is correct, but also they have to give us a notion of final pay figure. That's essential in calculating things like the annual allowance. Also use benefit illustration, so there might be there. This is quite a challenge for students. Struggle with understanding sometimes complexities around pay, final pay, final salary, care pay. And there will be some sort of issues of financial penalties for some employers or non-submission of data throughout the year. So we're getting a little bit tougher with our employers now. We've brought in a really high-tech system to help them with their responsibilities to go to yes. So we're making it as easy for them as possible, but where they default on giving, we are sort of getting a bit tougher, and that new process is where we identify data or late data and we send them financial penalties. The next item is just a summary of employer movements. We've got a couple of new employers coming in. One leaving, which is Sal Valuable Partnership. That's actually going back to the that's a slightly different scenario. That's everything I've covered on the report. Is anything?
I'll take you back to this question of payments made to pensioners overseas that carried on after they died. This will also affect the state pension. So do you get communications from the state pensions if they receive notification that the person's died?
There's no sharing, and if you think of them, it's not fraud information instead, it's all the difficulty of getting information. It's much easier. So we can use things like national fraud data, and that's all connected with the processes. It's quite hard. There's nothing to say that every overseas pensioner will be entitled to state pension. Well, there might be other state pensions. But it would be interesting to know what benefit they do. I know a bit more about what other public sector schemes. I don't know what they do.
You don't receive information back from HM Revenue and Customs either,
No.
i.e. because they have their all-powerful Connect software that has information about all taxpayers. You don't obviously get any information back from them. Everything's fed into Revenue and Customs.
We can request death certificates, but again, that will only be and we do a lot of work with the NFI. But again, it's UK based. It's just a bit of a struggle. I think there.
Any other questions? I think I'll probably just say one thing. Now got the new chairman of the board, Richard Bates, and I think our intention is to invite him to these meetings in the future. And I usually go to the board meetings as well, so we maintain a good two-way communication between us and others. And I think it probably would be a reasonable time to consider having a look again at the workload of the board compared to the board of our committee, and make sure that we're dividing the things, appropriately. Because at times it feels like we're just doing the same thing twice over, and they have a distinctive role which is different from our role as a committee, and really we need to make sure that we're not duplicating work unnecessarily, but also that we need to keep communication in play so that they know what we're doing, and vice versa. So I'm sure we can work on that and bring some back to the committee in the future. Okay, right. Next we'll move on slightly to item 10. Councillor Beasley, do you want to bring us up to date?
Thank you very much indeed, Chairman. And first of all, of course, in the training session yesterday, I ran through some of the issues, and one or two of those perhaps I'll spend a little less time on this morning, but very receptive to questions from members of the committee to fill in any of the gaps. In no particular order, I'm reporting back, I suppose, on the Scheme Advisory Board meeting, which took place on the 22nd of May. That's a quarterly report, as indeed, of course, is the Brunel Oversight Board, and their last meeting took place very recently on the 8th of June. And so these are relatively timely. And the two are interlinked to some extent, particularly around coordination with government and the bigger pooling picture, as we all know. In the order that I have them on the agenda, starting with Brunel's remuneration policy, I'm not sure whether, I don't want to step on Aidan Dunn's toes as the shareholder representative, but we have, I think, made considerable progress in that respect. It's been a very difficult situation, and I congratulate Aidan and others for the work they've done on it to take us forward. And I think perhaps I covered that to the extent that it needs to be covered yesterday. The critical issues, I think, for us are, first of all, as you will be aware, we managed to get some substantive changes to the presentation of Brunel's papers, probably 2 cycles ago now, and I'm wondering if members of the committee are happy with where we've got to with that consistency, having seen it now for those 2 sets of reports, and if there are further changes or improvements that we want to make, particularly around simplification, about the headline issues, so that members can get into the detail if they so wish, but if they just want the headlines, they've got those in clear format. And that was I think a serious issue that was addressed and is now improved, and I suspect that Steve may have some issues over that, and perhaps those can be drawn out. But one of the things that I'm there to do on behalf of Dorset is to make sure that Brunel is presenting us as a committee with the information we require in a timely manner and with sufficient clarity for everybody to absorb it quickly. So you might want to think about, are there further improvements needed? It hasn't been a matter of discussion at the Brunel Oversight Board recently. In fact, it hasn't been since I first brought it up as a response to Dorset, but we may want to go back and say further if that's the desire of the committee. Turning, if I may, to the pooling consultation with government. This is an issue both for the Scheme Advisory Board and for Brunel. There is work going on, but it is fair to say, I think, that the progression of that work, particularly as far as response from government is concerned, has to a certain degree stalled. And as a result, the consultation has really not made very much progress thus far, which I think is a pity, because I think it may not be a priority for DLUC, but it certainly is a priority for pooling. And I think the continued pressure that is being put on, particularly I have to say through the officers from Brunel, to participate and to make that happen is something that we'll all want to support. Because without that clarity, without that progression, I sort of feel that pooling is left in a bit of a vacuum as far as government is concerned, and we do need that clarity urgently. And with that in mind, Brunel is engaging both with Treasury and indeed with the Shadow Chancellor, because it's important, whatever the outcome of the next general election, that there's continuity between pooling and, of course, the LGPS in general, and the government's understanding and attitude towards it. So I'm very encouraging of that, and I think if we get something out of it, obviously I can report that back to this committee, but at the moment it is left a little bit in limbo until we have those meetings concluded. But there seems to be a real will at Brunel to do this. I suppose not least because the uncertainty is extremely unhelpful for everybody. And we need to be clear about whether there will be a move by government to mandate some of the pooling issues. That's one thing, which they haven't done up till now, not even initially, in fact. And I suppose equally important is the government's attitude towards this allocation towards infrastructure, perhaps later towards housing, affordable housing in particular, and how that interlinks with the levelling up agenda. Because I think levelling up, regardless of whoever is in government in the future, the principle of levelling up is going to continue. Steve referred to it earlier on, and some pension funds within Brunel are looking at that, most notably, as we know, in Cornwall. But I think there may be grounds for us in Dorset to want to be looking at it as well, as we've indicated earlier in this meeting. So all of that interlinks with government expectation, with the extent to which we want to participate in that, and how that will be viewed within Brunel, and given our ability to do it through Brunel rather than perhaps doing it separately and outside of Brunel, which I think would be an unfortunate move, but if it's necessary, that's what we'll have to do. So we want to consider that, and I know that we're going to do so in the future. But in the meantime, I will try to report back to this committee whatever it is that the department, DLUC, are proposing out of pooling. But at the moment, sadly, there doesn't appear to be anything further to report. The next issue, I think, just very briefly, Chairman, is just to remind members of the committee about the principles of responsible investment and how they're being dealt with by Brunel. And they've had a lot of representation from us and from others, and of course from the Environment Agency, who are one of the 10 funds. And I would encourage all members of this committee to look at both our climate policy through Brunel, which is very clear, and the climate stocktake. Now, both of these are on the Brunel website, and I recommend them to members of the committee because they are worth looking at, absorbing and understanding where we are and where we're going to. And I think it will also stress to all of us what not only the current stance is, but what Brunel are doing further, if you like, in expecting managers of the companies of the partnership owns, and where we want to see that going in the future. And that may inform us much better, I think, going forward around what we expect of Brunel in the responsible investment part of the business. In terms of transition, appreciating we haven't heard from Brunel this morning, I just wanted to say that overall in Brunel, transition is now at about 84% of assets transitioned. Dorset obviously is slightly lower, and over the past quarter, that's from Q4 in 2022 to Q1 in 2023, Dorset has increased from 72 to 76. So that's against the overall in Brunel, which is 84. And of course, to get that percentage, that implies that some of our partners in Brunel are very, very close to complete transition. We know the reasons why we haven't in Dorset, but I think it's important just to keep an eye, if you like, on where we are in the process. I think, Chairman, that's about all I have at this stage. And I'm very happy to answer questions from members. As I say, a lot of other issues were covered in the training session yesterday, but I'm happy to recap on any of those if required. Thank you, Chairman.
Very much. Any questions for Councillor Beasley? Yes, please.
I've just got a couple of follow-up points. So I want to thank you very much for that, John. That's very helpful. There are a couple of things I agree with you about the client reports. Just from my perspective on the client reports of Brunel is that 6 months ago, 2 cycles ago, there was a step change improvement in the reports, and the most important aspect of that was a lot less waffle. It's as simple as that. Now that, and it's interesting to hear that they're still receptive to further feedback, because I've got 1 or 2 kind of more subtle points about data and the way that things are presented, so I'll come back with those. But if anybody else has on reading the reports, because those reports are important that we study those. The second thing is you mentioned the climate policy and the stock take, which were documents that came around a few months ago now, and they are on the Brunel website. But actually, I think it'd be quite, I don't know whether they've been circulated to the members of the committee. It's quite nice to have those ready, easily presented.
The original link.
Oh, was that? Okay, all right.
I don't think there's anything physically being.
Okay, because that is a good. I mean, they are good documents. There.
And I'm happy to resend those. Yeah, those links.
Probably as part of the process when we go into more detail and look at net zero at our September meeting.
Pre-read for that.
That'll be part of the papers that we look at with that.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Yeah. No, sorry, that's it. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much, Councillor John. Very good talk. In response to your first question, I would say that I would appreciate some training on the finer points of the reports which are coming to us from Brunel. You know, only having been on the committee for 3 years, I need to catch up. So I just put in a plea really for some training to be considered around that area, looking much more critically at the information which is coming from Brunel to give us as committee members an insight.
I think I know where you're coming from. I think what you're saying, because I've got the same. When they come out, there's a lot in there. There's a lot of detail. I go to certain sections of the report and I pull out conclusions from them, which frame my overall picture. And I think that's what you're asking for, sort of maybe guidance. It's almost like a
yes.
You know, I think I could do that independent of Brunel at some point.
Yeah.
The training. I mean, you know, yeah, the next training.
Thank you.
Anybody else? No? Thank you very much, John. Very helpful as always. And I'm sure we're going to rely on you for a lot of help and assistance in managing the relationship with Brunel going forwards as well. So thank you very much for that. And I think what you said yesterday was also very useful to know as well. And I'm sure we could make sure that you're able to carry on keeping us well abreast of what's going on on your side of things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman. And as you will know from yesterday, we're hoping to take forward some of these issues outside of the meeting, but in the next cycle before our next Dorset meeting. So hopefully we'll have more to report then.
Yeah. Good. Thank you very much. Then moving on to item 11. And Steve, it's your report.
Yeah. And Brunel, are Brunel joining us today, or don't know?
We're hoping they're going to join at 11:40. So
right,
got time for yours.
Okay. Right. So my report is in the pack. I'll say a little bit about the market and economic background, and then comment a little bit about Brunel and performance of the fund overall. Generally, it has been quite a strong year for equity markets, and equities are, as we know, over half of our assets. Global equities are up 5% in sterling terms this year, and they've continued in May, being up a further 2%. It's been a little bit 3 steps forward, 2 steps back at times, but essentially the tone of equity markets is generally firm. And within that, there are a couple of highlights that I would draw out. One is something that we don't hear about much in the UK, and that is that Japanese equities, which we don't have a specific dedicated allocation to because that's wrapped within our global equity exposures, Japanese equities are doing quite well this year. And every sort of 10 or 15 years, the Japanese equities have their day in the sun, and they're having a little day in the sun this year. And there is talk about improved shareholder value engagement by Japanese companies, but we'll see whether that proves to be long-lasting. I'm a little bit skeptical about that because I've heard that story so many times over the past 30 or 40 years. So Japan is one area that's doing quite well. The other area, which is more dominant in terms of the overall impact on the equity markets, and I think it's mentioned in the Brunel report, and Brunel will probably touch on this as well, is that in America, it's been a very concentrated market. So I think the top 5 or 10 stocks have accounted for the vast bulk of the gains in the S&P 500, which is the American index. So, the Googles, the Apples, the Nvidias, which is a chip maker. And that's, possibly connected to the fact that there's one of the emerging themes this year in markets has been artificial intelligence. And at the committee training yesterday, one of the things that I mentioned is that I think two of the big picture events that we need to consider over the next few years will be, as well as climate change, will be artificial intelligence, and that's its impact on economies, on jobs, on markets. And in fact, I'm going to a presentation tomorrow on that subject. It's at the moment we're all in a learning process, I think, as to what the investment implications will indeed be. But so I think that's watch this space. So it's been quite narrow leadership in the US. The other thing that's been going on, obviously, in terms of the economy, is interest rates. So in my reports about 9 months ago, I said that I thought that a recession in the UK and globally was highly likely. As the winter progressed, this last winter progressed, it seemed that the major economies have managed to avoid serious recessions. The Eurozone is technically in a recession at the moment. It's just had reported 2 slightly negative quarters of GDP. The UK hasn't technically fallen into recession. The US has not technically fallen into recession either. But we're very far from out of the woods, in my opinion. And I still think that we are somewhat at risk of of economic challenges, principally because the tightening cycle isn't completed yet, the tightening cycle of interest rates by central banks. And we see that in what's happening in America and in what's happening in the UK most topically. So take for America, for example, we've had several increases in interest rates, as you know, by the Federal Reserve. There's an inflation figure out at 1:30 today. The Federal Reserve has its meeting tomorrow. They may skip a meeting in terms of raising rates, but the markets think they're likely to do, a couple more raises of 4.5%. So but the cycle isn't quite finished tightening. In the UK, you know what is happening in terms of the mortgage market, and the pain that is bringing to anybody with a mortgage, or particularly the renewal of a mortgage at the moment. So that pain in terms of the consumer and consumer spending hasn't fully been felt yet in the UK. So I think that carries consumer spending risks to the UK economy. So I think we're far from out of the woods. But the reason the equity markets are still doing quite well, or modestly well, is that they're beginning to anticipate the end of that cycle of tightening. We'll see how that all plays out. The other thing that is happening, following on from interest rates, is that gilt yields are rising. I think it's a very good thing that we got out of the LDI investments last year, because there's quite a lot of indexing gilts in those. Real rates are still rising, and in fact, this quarter, real rates at the beginning of this quarter were 0.3%, having been in the recent past negative -1%, -2%. They were 0.3% at the beginning of this quarter. Now they're 0.9% positive. We are beginning to see positive real rates. Mercer touched on this in their presentation a little bit yesterday. Way back in time, real rates always used to be positive 2%, 3% positive. And that is a kind of more normal environment. So that's happening there. So those are some of the kind of economic backgrounds. It's still a highly uncertain economic situation. In terms of inflation, headline inflation is coming down in the UK. But as we've discussed at previous meetings, although it may come down, I suspect it's going to plateau at a higher level than it has in the past. So I think we're going to get that the market environment is going to be one of higher average inflation over the next 10 years than it has been over the past 10 or 20 years. And I think that has got implications for the markets and the way that Brunel manages its funds. I will ask them about that today, and we should continue to push them on that, because Brunel has a kind of a tilt in its portfolios towards growth stocks and away from value stocks, and that's partly because of its responsible investing footprint. But the maths of growth and value is that growth stocks do better in low interest rate environments and less well in higher interest rate environments. And it may be that we've had the lower interest rate environment in the past, and we're facing a higher interest rate environment in the future. So that may, having been a tailwind for that type of investing over the past 10 years, may become more of a headwind in the future. So that's a challenge point for Brunel. The fund performance was, I've used the word, greatly improved in Q1. I'm sure Brunel will love to tell us about this. Up 3.2% versus benchmark performance of 1.4%. The one-year performance still lags, -4.8% versus -2.8% for the benchmark. Now, there are two things going on. One is that Brunel's performance is much improved in Q1. They had a very difficult time in the first half of last year. It started to improve and stabilise in the second half of the year. It's improved again in Q1. We should ask them today, if we can, how it's going into Q2. They still have to, we still hope that they recover some of that lost performance in 2022 in coming quarters and get back into a position where the performance is better than the benchmark since inception. There's a second factor which does confuse the performance statistics, and this is back to the point that was asked about the Brunel reports. I mentioned it in the last quarter, which is the private markets. The problem with private markets is that they don't value with the same frequency that public markets do, because they're valued by people valuing the assets, not by the exchange of stock markets, publicly stock market, every day, valuing a property or a debt, a private debt, or a private equity investment, or private unlisted things. So private markets don't always match exactly where the benchmarks are, and there's always a delay with the with the public markets. So it does confuse the performance statistics. It happened in Q4 in property, and it's still happening a little bit in Q1 in our property portfolio when you look in detail at the numbers that are reported to you. That creates a bit of confusion in the numbers. There's some things we can do about it, but there's not a lot. We just have to live with it and kind of wait for it to wash out, particularly at a time when you get a rapid sudden change down in Q4 and starting to recover in Q1 in the private market investments. Another factor in Q1 performance, which I mentioned here, is that the 2022 troubles in public markets are finally taking a toll on our external private market managers. If you remember, we've got two managers, Harbour Best in private equity, IFM in infrastructure, who have got a great long-term record, and their average return is in the teens over the long term, and both of them had difficult first quarters. And it's kind of to be expected. The long-term returns still look very, very strong. It's just a function of where we are in the cycle, that where private markets are finally catching up with what public markets did in the first half of last year. So I'm sorry for that confusion. We just have to kind of look through it a little bit and look to the kind of longer term performance numbers, which are still good. The other thing I mentioned in my report is the investment strategy, which has now been approved. And those, I think, are the main points that I was going to cover today. I've got some questions that we might want to ask Brunel about, and we'll raise those when they join the meeting. Yes.
Is it fair to say that Governor of the Bank of England was perhaps over optimistic in terms of inflation if we go back to February, and to the extent that the UK economy matters within our pension fund, we are on something of a rocky road at the moment. And you did mention property, and we're in circumstances where we had rising interest rates, we've had difficulties in mortgage rates, and we live at a time where many people's 2-year fixed mortgages are coming to an end, and those mortgages were taken out in a great rush at a time when there were stamp duty benefits. So there is a great deal of difficulty within certain sectors of the UK economy, not least of which is property, which was borne out by Crest Nicholson last week.
Yeah. So on the Bank of England, the Bank of England has, I think, managed things very disappointingly over the past few years, basically. They were way too complacent when rates should have been rising earlier. The way they managed the pandemic. And the Bank of England, in the opinion of the markets, has lost a lot of credibility. Knowing eventually where, it's setting monetary policy is not easy, because they're looking at the same things that we're looking at in terms of like what's happening on a month-to-month basis with inflation. So it's not a job that you'd necessarily want, but they played their hand very badly, I think, over the past few years, and they need to restore that credibility. So that's the response of the Bank of England. In terms of housing, that's exactly what I was trying to say earlier about the mortgage rates and the impact that has, and suddenly people who were paying £1,200 a month are paying £2,500 a month in the squeeze in the mortgage rate. Yes, it is going to show up in the housing market. It's not the whole population, but there's certain sections of the population are actually going to be squeezed quite hard, and I do think that's going to impact the overall tone of the UK economy. There are a lot of other things. I mean, we don't, as a fund, like many pension funds nowadays, don't have a huge amount of assets in UK equities, and the UK equity market has, sadly, you might say, become a bit of a backwater relative to global markets, because the global markets have been much more diversified. The UK market has been concentrated in the super, the miners and the oil stocks and the banks, those sort of super big mega cap stocks. So, and there's quite a lot of policy discussion around that now, because politicians have realised and commentators have realised that we may have over 20 or 30 years disenfranchised the way the UK economy as a consequence of the UK market, as a consequence of UK pension funds. The defined benefit pension funds are typically de-risked. They're in gilts. They've got out of they got out of UK equities into global equities, then they got out of equities altogether, and they've shuffled those risks off to insurance companies. That's what's happening in the private sector. And consequently, there's nobody left to invest in UK equities, and of course, politicians are latching onto that and beginning to propose solutions. And there's a proposal out there at the moment that the PPF be given a new mandate, and that mandate be, rather than being the PPF doesn't apply to the LGPS. The PPF is a pension protection fund, is the lifeboat for UK defined benefit schemes that are in trouble. And if you're in trouble, if you're insolvent, essentially, you go into the lifeboat. The lifeboat rescues you at a proportion of your members' benefits, which is most of them, but not fully. So there's a proposal that the PPF act as a consolidator within the UK benefit, or the UK corporate defined benefit industry, and also be given a new mandate to invest in UK growth. The things that government would like to see happen. So I think we'll just have to see how that develops, basically.
Thank you. You did quite a bit about interest rates, which you always do. I mean, it's standard in your report to comment on them. And then you did make a little bypass reference to a recession, which I always think recession situations is really just it's a single step digital analysis of what is a continually moving scenario. And I'm not always sure that I quite like the step they choose, except it's going from, if you like, from growth to retraction. What I'm more concerned about, and I wanted your views on this, is when you look at GDPs between the high economic countries around the world, the G7 or even more than that, or European ones, when you look at the comparisons between them, we're always doing very poorly.
Yeah.
And to me, that's more of an issue.
Yeah.
Than just simply, is it recession or not recession?
Yeah, this is why politicians are focusing on, what is the problem with the UK economy. I don't want to get into political positions, but essentially there's a long-standing problem, which is a problem with UK productivity, which I remember the deputy governor of the Bank of England asking me this question about 15 years ago, and I didn't have an answer then. It's been going on for 2 decades. There's a problem with UK productivity, and arguably it does come back to the investment in capital investment in the UK. There's been a lack of investment in the UK. I think that's one problem. The other problem is that we suffer the impact of Brexit. This is why I don't want to get into political situations. There has been a Brexit impact on the UK economy, and that's why we're losing growth in recent years because of that.
So if I can just follow up on this one, so therefore we're quite well weighted to global equities compared with UK.
Yeah.
But shouldn't we be even more weighted to global because of that situation?
That's a great question. Well, let's put that into the pot for discussion at the, because there's going to be a further discussion about equity allocation overall. It's I kind of I can't help feeling that we ought to have a little bit more in UK equities than it is its proportion in the market cap world indices. It just doesn't feel totally right to be kind of underweight our domestic markets. But let's put that into the pot for discussion.
Sounding like I'm on a sinking ship, but I'm going to stay on it.
Yeah. Well, and then there's another aspect, which is that Brunel. I think they mentioned it at the last committee meeting, or that certainly one of the catch-up sessions that we had, and we can ask them today. Are talking about revising the mandate of their UK active equity fund so that it isn't just, so it's a bit more mid-cappy and a bit more broader, less of a mega cap bias. I mean, so I think it's already underweight mega caps, but it's a bit of a broader kind of portfolio. So they're talking about having another look at that mandate, and I think that would be probably quite a good thing. So I'm interested in where they go with that, and I hope that they've got the resource to get on with doing that. Yeah,
I was just going to add one comment to that Steve might be able to jump in anyway. Is that investing in the UK market, the overwhelming majority of the income that those companies derive is overseas income anyway, and I think it's something like 70% of FTSE 100. The income coming through is in non-sterling. So you're not actually investing in the UK when you invest in these large global companies, and I think that is one of the things that Brunel and together with the client funds are looking at as to can we reposition that UK equity portfolio that they provide so that it's it is focused on the UK as opposed to multinationals that just happen to be headquartered in the UK. There's another question then as to how much, or if anything, that we choose to allocate or committee choose to allocate, but then it will be more UK focused that portfolio, so that you are actually investing in the UK.
I mean, there's another thing too, that's been a bit depressing about the UK, which is that we've got all this great intellectual capital, science, and yet companies like ARM, which is it's in every phone just about in the world. It was in the UK, and then it goes off and lists in New York. Other companies are choosing to kind of list in New York because they there's a technology has become so important to economic development in the past 20 years. We're good at generating little companies, but then when they want to be big companies, they go off to America or and that's the government wants to, and any government wants to change that, which is why a lot of pressure has been put on SoftBank, who were the seller of ARM, to kind of list it in London rather than list it in America. Those type of issues are kind of disappointing to reflect on.
I was just wondering about April. My understanding was that the inequality is harming itself and our policy and our country. That is having whether we get and comparing with other countries that we are more unequal.
Yeah.
And then in terms of UK companies and Brunel, I'd be interested in Dorset itself, in terms of the pension fund, being able to invest in our own, the children of the people that are going to receive the pension. Surely that makes sense to be investing in sort of the next generation.
So a couple of things. So first of all, on inequality, yes, we have an inequality problem in the UK, same as we do have in America. It's the same thing.
Yeah. But that is worse compared with other European countries.
Yeah,
The
I think it is.
States
I think it's right.
Yeah,
I think that's right. Yeah. And does that impede us economically? Yes, it does, yeah. on the thing about children, I think what you're getting at there is invest. Brunel's tagline is investing for a world worth living in, which I think it goes to your point about the children of future generations.
Yeah. Investing in their own.
Do you mean like investing in the local economy?
Yeah.
So investing in infrastructure products.
Some of those will be their own.
Yeah, I mean these are sort of structural issues that you're raising, yeah. What's your specific question?
Well, if we're asking for now to identify companies not like invested in the UK structure, not just then I would also be interested in. Okay, what about Dorset?
Oh, Dorset, within Dorset itself.
Yeah. We can only invest. We only know that we're investing in future generations.
Yeah, I mean,
I think some of the difficulty might be that the bulk of our assets are invested in big companies, as you know, and they're traded on the stock market, so you can buy and sell and get in and out. And then we have the private market stuff, which is very liquid and invest for a long time. If you look purely at the Dorset economy, there really aren't the companies to invest in that are big to buy and sell. So it would all be some type of private situation. So we would have to investigate the company, either by their debt or their equity or something like that, and try to do it that way, or we invest in shopping malls or something, or things that are Dorset. It's not. It is possible to do all those things, but there aren't easy ways to do it because the companies are very, very small and individual based, and a lot of them will be owned by families and local families rather than big corporations. So it makes it more challenging to try and do it. But if they are looking at restructuring that fund anyway, it might be an idea to mention it to Brunel.
There may be nothing about it. And there are big opportunities for community-owned organisations. So in the future, but the first step is to identify and even see the data now for measuring, and then over 10 years be able to
with one of my other hats on, as Aidan's aware, we're doing about to do a scrutiny review on the national grid, because the problem in Dorset is that there's nobody willing to invest in renewable energy, because you have to link it into the national grid to make it worthwhile. It's phenomenally expensive unless you are right next to a major centre for electricity supply. And there's one of those near Chickerell, where there's a plan at the moment to build a huge scheme there. But most of Dorset doesn't have it. So I think we've been told something like 200 sites for renewable energy I can't proceed at the moment because there's nobody to pay for the link to the national grid. But that's a big structural issue for the Dorset economy. So we can try and do all these worthy things, but we can't actually do it in practice because there's no actual way of physically investing the money and creating the company, or at least not at the moment anyway.
Yeah.
I think it would be beneficial, given your interest, to have an update from Brunel, maybe not on this particular day, but on what they're doing with their private markets investments. So, because they are absolutely investing in renewable energy. I don't think any of it is in Dorset. So, but it's still a good thing that they are increasing their investment in renewable energy, and even if it's another. So I think that's a kind of takeaway from that. One takeaway from that. I think the other angle, I think the affordable housing angle that we're going to discuss in the future is quite topical to your points about the.
It'd be structural for the whole.
In terms of the general UK exposure, there'll be very little exposure in practice to Dorset because there aren't any sort of big companies or many big companies headquarters in Dorset.
Is that what we want to see? If we're talking about 10 years of Dorset, want to be able
The other observation I would have is just to be a little bit careful. Probably can't say too much in kind of general, but I was an advisor to another county, another shire pension fund, and the officers and myself were picking up the pieces of an investment that had been made in a regional. 15 years ago, quite a long time ago, they decided to invest into their region, to invest in smaller companies, and it hadn't been at all a successful investment proposition. It was probably quite well structured at the time. It's just that it just didn't have critical mass, and it hadn't had a return. So, and we were picking up the pieces of the exit from that over multiple years. So, I mean that comes back down to the original investment. Were not, even though they were diversified, they weren't particularly well thought through. So yeah, it can be done.
Okay. One final thing. I keep trying to remember back to the days when we used to have inflation and that are more perhaps similar to what we've got today rather than what we had in the last 5 to 10 years. And part of that is from memory, it always feels that whenever central banks try to do something about inflation, they're always too late to the game in starting it.
Yeah.
They half the time go too far and lead to a major recession when they probably didn't need to go that far. But I mean, also other times inflation can be very sticky. Yeah. That it requires more interest rates being hitting the economy in a forceful way very early on to get inflation under control. But what often tends to happen is that the economy gets through this, like we're doing at the moment. We have a bit of we don't quite have a recession, so they feel that they've done enough in terms of interest rate rises. But then the inflation doesn't come down; it sticks at the higher rate. So then they feel they have to put interest rate yet again, and it's that then leads to the recession, and finally maybe doing something about inflation. But the whole thing also takes longer to happen than people think it does at the start. And inflation does tend to be a major problem. And I despair at times that the Bank of England has been too slow. They've missed opportunities where the United States was raising rates and they haven't followed at the same pace. And it just makes they haven't got control of the economy. And particularly as an unfortunate thing for the UK is that a lot of this has been going on at the same time as the Liz Truss experiment, doing a huge amount of fiscal credibility and damage. So yeah, I think we should get used to the idea that inflation is going to be around for a bit longer. It's going to be more like 7 or 8% rather than 4 or 5, and that we'll probably get another round of interest rate rises at some point when it proves that the previous medicine hasn't quite worked as well as they'd hoped it would work.
I agree with all of that completely. I think that's an entirely plausible scenario that you described, except for the bit about how sticky inflation is going to be about 7 or 8. I just wonder. I mean, my personal feeling is probably going to be a couple of points, stick around a couple of points lower than that, because there will be a natural anniversarying effect of obviously the oil price, the commodity prices, the food prices. So we remember a conversation with Councillor Wharf about that inflation might be in the UK might be zero by the end of this year, but I don't think it will. But it's going to dip and then it's going to be settled at some level.
That scenario was based on the assumption that war in Ukraine probably will be over quickly, and you might suddenly then get a big drop in commodity prices as things come back online again. But that seems less and less likely at the moment. The wars that will go on for years and years. And it has a permanent problem with its supply of energy and food from that part of the world. It is going to keep bubbling along under the surface.
I mean, I sincerely hope that it doesn't settle at 7 to 8%. That is going to be a big problem if it is. I think it's going to settle 4 or 5 or something, 4, 5, 6, which is still higher than the Bank of England's official forecast, which isn't. Now I think they'll be managing towards 3 rather than 2. So. But the thrust of your description, I think, is absolutely.
Anybody else want to ask Steve a thing? In which case, welcome, gentlemen. Thank you for joining us this morning. I guess it's over to you for you give us your views on the world at the moment.
Yeah.
Specifically our fund, of course.
Great. Yeah. Good morning. I'm glad we could make it. Just to introduce ourselves, I'm Tim Dixon in the client relationship team at Brunel, and I've got with me Simon Wood, who's head of listed markets and has been with us 2 months.
Three. I'm permanent staff now. It's too late. They can't get rid of me.
Can't get rid of you. Okay, brilliant. So I'll hand over to Simon, who will give a quick overview, and then obviously we can take questions. Just to warn you that I certainly have to go in half an hour, but hopefully we can cover most of the ground in that.
Okay. Morning, everyone. So I hope you've got the pension fund performance report for end of Q1. That's what I'll be referring to. Obviously, I know you want to go into more year-to-date stuff as well, so I'll try and cover that as best I can too. If you would refer to page 15 on in the performance report, the Chief Investment Officer commentary. As you can see, equities got off to a good start in 2023. The MSCI World Index was up 5%. This was mainly on the back of optimism that inflation and interest rates had peaked and that China was reopening after COVID. So, in fact, in January, markets were really strong, and there was nothing, quite frankly, there was nothing really there behind that. There was no data really to suggest that interest rates or inflation had peaked, but I think it was just optimism and the start of a new year that investors were more hopeful than anything that things would improve after a very tricky 2022. Of course, shortly after that, we then had Silicon Valley Bank going bust, and then Credit Suisse, which really put a brake on markets and caused a lot more uncertainty again. But conversely, against that, also that sort of put a brake on and made people think that interest rates maybe wouldn't need to rise quite so much. But again, we saw SVB got bought out by HSBC over here. And other banks in America, and then Credit Suisse being purchased by UBS. So those kind of fears have dissipated a little bit. And in fact, the banks have, particularly the regional banks in the US, have made a very strong recovery since that point. In these market conditions in Q1, it was a good market for growth. Growth stocks were up over 12%, whereas value were only up 2%. Now, this is pretty much a big reversal on 2022, where value outperformed by a very big margin. And if we go back even further, that was a reversal from 21 where growth had continued to outperform. But I think the thing that concerned us was that 70% of the MSCI return had been generated by 6 companies, Amazon, Apple, Alphabet, Microsoft, Tesla, and one that I'm sure you're all familiar with now, NVIDIA, which at the time of writing this at the end of Q1 was up 85%. But now it's up well over 100%, as you've probably seen with all the information around AI. Emerging markets were a little bit weaker due to geopolitics. China, US, that continues, and China, Taiwan, and then also with the balloon incident over Taiwan as well. So there's been plenty for markets to worry about as well. But as I say, overall markets did quite well. And if you don't mind turning to page 11, I can talk you through what's happened on the portfolios that we manage for you. It was quite a pleasing quarter for us. 6 of the 7 managers outperformed over the quarter. So, we are pleased with that. It has performed, but we do acknowledge that there's still work to be done to catch up from the disappointing performance from 2022, where most of those returns were, where most of the damage was done in Q1. So if you'd like me to go into more detail on individual portfolios, I'll happily do that. But if you'd rather just fire questions at me, I'm happy to go as you wish.
Steve, do you want to ask the question?
I've got a few things that I've got noted down as questions to ask Simon. Actually, since you've only been with us for over 3 months, one of the first questions is a bit unfair. Actually, Tim might want to field it, which I just want to ask about staff turnover in the last 12 months. We've heard a little bit about some staff leaving Brunel, somebody on the RI team. Simon's new, obviously. So, can you say something about staff turnover and retention, how that's going?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that, given that I've been there the last year to see it. Listed markets, actually turnover has not been that high, aside from the fact obviously we've got a new head of listed markets, so that's been reasonably stable. The issue has been more in private markets, where basically the private sector is able to attract away the portfolio managers in that area and double their wage, and we've had trouble recruiting as a result of that. We have put in a sort of way to get around that for the moment, which is for private market, for private equity cycle 3, we've actually outsourced effectively the management of that. So we feel we can, we're fine as we are, but it would be better to fill those vacant roles on the private market side, and we're looking for that. So it is problematic, and that is really because the managers on that side of the business they can get very high salaries in the private sector.
And on the responsible investing team, you lost a member of staff, or maybe 2 members of staff there. Have you been able to replace them?
Yeah, we have recruited on RI. Yeah, so we've got a new head of stewardship starting, I think early July. That was the big one that left. We had another one leave last year, and we recruited.
Okay.
Steve, just on the listed market side as well. So as you know, David Cox left towards the end of last year, and I've replaced him. Then we lost a senior portfolio analyst earlier, about 2 months ago, which was very sad. We were really did rate him, but he's gone to work in London. Just a new opportunity for him. But we've replaced him. We recruited somebody on Friday, so they'll be starting by the end of next month. So quite positive for us.
Okay. Mentioning RI brings me on to my second question, which is about the climate policy. So I think I read somewhere in your report, the quote that I wrote down is, climate policy has further turned the screws on our... So climate policy has further turned the screws on our managers. It must be in the RI report or in David Vickers' report somewhere. I've written it down. So
sure.
I'm not sure where I got it from. So
no, I remember reading that.
Yeah, I don't want you were looking a bit puzzled for a second. So basically, like, what does that mean in practice? And how do you know that you're having, what real world impact is that having? I mean, this may be a more general question for the responsible investing team, but I want to ask it anyway. So what real world impact is that having? So what does that shift in the climate policy mean in practice in terms of turning the screws? And how do you know it's having a real world impact?
Okay. Well, I think what David means by turning the screws is that we are engaging and putting more pressure on our managers. Although, as you know, we don't have as all of us, we don't have an exclusion policy, so we can't necessarily, say you can't buy any stocks in particular. But we're just, we continue to push. So tar sands would be a great example of this, where we're pushing harder and harder. With Royal London is the one that typically has the tar sands exposure, and we've been pushing harder on them to sort of explain why they think this is a good opportunity, and they do think it's an attractive opportunity for the company, and the fact that they'll be transitioning by towards net zero in 2030. But they've got tar sands, it's very hard. It is quite a hard company, sort of industry to justify holding that, but they just think there's opportunities there, and that they are moving in the right direction. So, but we will just continue to push, and now the RI team's going to be up to strength again. We're pushing even harder, and we've actually just engaged with Bath University. They're going to do a project for us, some of their graduates, to look at the effects of AI on sustainability as well. So we, as you know, and we do take it very seriously, but we just continue to put pressure on. But all the while that we can't instruct companies to, our fund managers to exclude companies, it will only be pressure that we can apply, and that's all we can say.
Okay. Okay, I'll keep asking questions unless anybody wants to jump in. So turning back to the page on investment performance, I mean, well done on having a better quarter. Obviously, we'd like to see many quarters like this. Can you update us on relative performance Q2, please?
Sure. Yeah, I'll do the best. I might just have to take you off screen, Steve, if that's okay, for a second, because I've just got it on a different part of my screen. Okay, so if
I mean, an overview, Simon. I mean, we don't have to hear every number, but just
okay.
Yeah.
So I think, frankly, as I said, Q1 was very nice, but I think Q2's been a little bit weaker. Again, sort of the value managers have sort of come back a little bit to the fore with, further concerns about interest rate rises and inflation. So I think that's been part of the problem. And as I said at the start, I think investors were overly optimistic in Q1, it's particularly January, when they were thinking that inflation and interest rates were totally under control. And I don't think we're quite there yet. And you can see they're talking about maybe the Fed might have to raise rates a little bit more at the moment. So I think that's what's caused our uncertainty. And look, as you know, I only just come in, and I've faced these situations before myself in earlier in my career when the numbers aren't quite as attractive as you'd like them to be. So what I've got the team to do is to go back, revisit all their managers, make sure that they understand the approach. And we do, I hope you realise that we do have a slight growth and quality bias in our portfolios, and the sort of the RI side of the investment would slightly lead us onto that side. So one of the things we've done is and the team did it before. I've not come in and set a revolution in place or anything like that. I don't want to suggest that these things weren't going on before, but what I've got the team to do is to sort of revisit how the portfolios are balanced, to see, are they happy? Are they quite happy with this balance? It's when we first launched, with the growth quality bias, I can see looking down portfolios in 19 and 20, having a growth quality bias would have, the portfolios would have done quite well, and they did do quite well. But it was last year, particularly Q1, when, well, we know what's happened, interest rates, Ukraine, etc., and we saw a complete turnaround to value. That's when we really underperformed, Q1 in particular. And if you look at the numbers from last year, energy, which I know you all appreciate, we'll be underweight, was up 62%. And the next best area was was utilities, up 8.4. So you can see how that's really hurt our portfolios. But if you look at our managers to compare to peer groups, they're still doing quite well. And now I know, I would be cynical on the other side if I was sitting on your side of the table as well. Okay, well, so we're doing nicely against the peer groups, but that means that they're not doing very well either, which is true. So it's something I want to say we're working hard, and we are working hard. We want to get it back, but there's no sort of miracle cure where we can just suddenly turn the tap on. And I don't want us to suddenly start taking more risk. When the markets fell as sharply as they did, it's very hard to recover from that and get it back as quickly. So I've just got the team to revisit all the managers, make sure they've got conviction there, understand the balance of their portfolios, and then we will be getting it back incrementally. I don't think we can say, I can't say to you there's going to be a massive turnaround unless growth goes on a real spurt like it did in Q1, where we performed quite well. But that's what I'm trying to get my team to look at is, if we think it's going to be a very uncertain market, and I think it is, because at the moment, the market conundrum, interest rates, inflation, recession, China reopening, and those things aren't going away. China's growth is slowing again. They're all things we've got to think about, and our managers will be thinking about when they're building their portfolios. So, as I say, when I've had troubles like this, I just go back and just try and reinforce my conviction in the managers, and the team are very happy with the managers we've got. We might think about tweaking the balance of the portfolio itself. And that's one thing I'm getting into.
I was going to ask, actually, has this actually resulted in any changes in rebalancing between the different funds?
Yeah, so that nothing has happened as yet. In one portfolio, in the sustainable portfolio, we've just increased our weighting in Jupiter, but that's not really market led. That's more conviction in that portfolio. When we took out Jupiter, it was a 5% position when we started. We've just got more conviction in that manager now, so we're upping it to 10%. That's also, it's nothing market related. But it's something we're working on, and I need to sit down with each individual member of the team, go through the portfolio with them, and it won't necessarily be a one-on-one. I'm quite happy for the rest of the team to chip in with their ideas, etc. Because obviously we have a lead manager and a deputy manager, but that's something we'll work on, and we continue to look at that, and we're continuing to look at other options as well. We don't want to the PMs are very happy with the portfolios they've got in terms of the managers underlying it, but there's no reason to be complacent. So we're doing a lot of looking for new managers as well, and see if there's anything that we think might be able to improve the portfolio. But I think if anything, and I'm not saying this is definite yet, but is anything, we would probably tweak the balance of the portfolio. I think that would be the most likely thing that would happen in the short term, but we're not quite yet there. I think if you're coming in new, as I am, I don't want to go in and start causing a revolution or anything like that. Everything's got to be done. I want to take the team with me. I don't want to come in and just say, well, no, you've got to do it this way, because that's just not the right approach to managing a team, I don't think.
I agree with that, Simon. So when will that process be complete to your satisfaction, do you think?
I think by end of Q, I don't really want to put a date, Steve, if you don't mind, but I think by Q3, and I'd hope to have it done before then. But I think it would be fair to say by Q3 I would have gone through every portfolio with the managers and sort of said, okay, how do we feel about the balance of this portfolio? Because the last thing I want to do is have a knee-jerk reaction, and we pivot more to value, and all of a sudden the markets switch back to growth, and so we've been whipsawed both ways. So as I say, I don't think there's too much wrong. I don't think there's anything wrong with the managers we've selected. But I just think the markets were extremely tough last year, and as you can see, other managers, I know that's not that doesn't really help our performance story, but it's interesting to see that other managers have struggled because of the way the market's been moving around. And I think as I said, I think at times like this, you need to stick with the manager if you're happy with them, and then when markets settle down a bit, you should see these managers come back to the fore.
Should I carry on?
Yes.
Yeah. So we've got a couple more minutes, or a few more minutes. So one thing I noticed somewhere in your report is that the carbon footprint of your global high alpha portfolio is lower than the carbon footprint of your sustainable portfolio.
Okay.
Yeah? How much attention do you pay to that, and why would that be?
Off the top of my head, Steve, I'm not sure. I might need to come back to you on that one if that's okay. But because I don't want to make something. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Tim, at all. But
well, I'd say first of all, they're not really measured against each other. Obviously, high alpha has a growth bias, which leads to a lot of tech in there, which is naturally relatively low carbon footprint anyway. We don't generally track them against each other. Obviously, what we're interested in is tracking that carbon footprint against the underlying benchmark.
Okay. Am I okay to keep going?
Yeah.
The Chancellor said that, I think it was the Chancellor, said recently that pools, now this may be something for the board rather than for yourselves, that the pools should be 50 billion in size. Brunel's 35 billion, roughly, I think. We did hear a little bit about this at another meeting, but what is? Are there any initiatives that you can share with us from Brunel's perspective?
I'm happy to answer this, Simon.
Thanks.
Obviously, it's at a very early stage. That was a figure that was mentioned in, I think it was in the budget, but not without any detail. We report to DLUC, the Department for Levelling Up, etc. We're having ongoing conversations with what that's going to mean. At the moment, they're suggesting it's not going to be a mandatory thing, but more a guideline. They're more focused as well on making sure listed assets are transitioned across rather than some of the non-listed private market stuff. And in fact, on those measures, we've done very well. We're 84% transitioned assets, and thanks in part to Dorset, who have obviously been moving assets across more recently. So I think it's at very early stages. My prediction is we're unlikely to see anything material over the next year or two. But obviously the board are, I guess, beginning to think about what that might mean in the longer term. But at the moment, it's at a very early stage. Personally, I don't think we'll see any hard progress on that for a good while.
Okay. Can I ask if Brunel is planning a training or sort of like in the autumn, past couple of autumns, I think you've had sort of investment days for members. Is that something that's planned this year?
Yeah. We're having an investor day. I think off the top of my head, it's 20th of September. It's actually going to be online this year. So we're going to do them alternately online and then offline. This year it will be online, and in fact I've just been putting the agenda together and we'll be circulating that to the client officers in the next couple of weeks.
So that's something that will come to the client officers and then it will go to the committee members, but that's open to members, isn't it?
It is. Yes, to committee members. Yeah,
that's what I meant.
And advisors.
And advisors. Thank you.
Yes, and IIAs, of course, Stephen. Yes, no problem.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to step in on that point, because you should have that as a hold in your diaries.
Okay.
Apologies, Councillor Rice, it won't be in your diary. I'll forward it to you.
Oh yes, sorry.
We actually did move the day because it clashed with one of your PC meetings, I think.
Yeah. Sorry.
Day after our next meeting, isn't it?
Yeah, forgot about that. Excellent. Okay. Good. Well, thank you for the questions. I mean, I think the $64 billion question is the one that Simon was discussing a few minutes ago about the environment. And we discussed it earlier on. The environment we've been in the past has had tailwinds. The environment in the future may have headwinds to the style bias in the Brunel portfolio. And I think how Simon and his team navigate that will be important for the outcome for Brunel's relative performance and consequently for our funds.
Okay. I think that's absolutely correct, Stephen. And as I say, so we are going to work on that. I think, truthfully, I think we still probably will have a growth quality bias in the portfolio, but it's just, I just want to understand, the magnitude of that bias, and then, obviously working with the PM, we can see whether we need to sort of maybe reduce that a little bit if we think it's too big. But it's something that we need to work on. And the other thing, Steve, I found the WACC, so I will have a word with the RI team and we'll come back to you on that if that's okay. That's for the carbon intensity.
Yeah. Does anybody else have any questions they'd like to ask? No. In which case, thank you very much for joining us this morning. So
affordable housing. Actually we could raise that now actually. So on our radar is some training for affordable housing. And we know that Cornwall has taken initiative in that respect. We'd quite like to hear about what Brunel has done with Cornwall on that. I think it has been covered actually. I think it was covered at last year's investor day, if I remember correctly. Can you remember that, Tim?
It was, yeah. We had Sean Johns, who's the Cornwall client officer, talking about it. Yeah,
that was it.
We could.
So we might. Is it? Can you give a kind of quick? Are you in a position to give a quick overview of how that was structured? But I mean, I think the intention would be when we come to do our own affordable housing training, we might want to ask Brunel, or we might want to ask Sean Johns, who's the officer at Cornwall, to have a chat, and then we'll talk to some other people as well.
Yeah, Sean Johns has been very happy to talk about it, or we can provide someone from our own team who can talk about it. Yeah, they were very interested in having a local portfolio, so there's a lot of renewable opportunities in Cornwall, but also they were interested in getting into affordable housing. So we've appointed managers to specifically look for opportunities in those areas. It's, I think 115 million was the size of the mandate, and it was roughly a 50-50 split, and that is getting deployed. But in terms of the actual deep down detail, it would be better to get someone like Sean or my colleague Chris to come and talk to you about it. But we'd be very happy to do that, and I could certainly forward the presentation to you from the investor day.
Okay, so perhaps we need to make a note of that as
Yeah.
something to follow up on.
Yeah.
And that's a 50-50 split between what the affordable housing and the renewables. Is that what you mentioned just then?
Yeah.
Or the two managers or something? But
Yes.
we can get right. Okay.
With a focus on it being a local Cornwall portfolio. There is allowance to be outside Cornwall to some extent, but the majority is meant to be within that county. But you know that doesn't have to be the way it's set up. So I mean, we'd be very happy to talk about it in terms of how it was achieved.
Yeah. Okay, good.
Hi, can I just ask a question? Just going back to the coal tar sand. And can you hear okay?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just leaning in. I can hear when I lean in.
The coal tar sand. So just very briefly, what is the plan with that company still investing in those? To save me having to look through your policy document, I assume you are giving them a target date potentially. But you just get to explain that for me.
So the company, the fund manager we use is Royal London. They're the ones, and they have got Suncor is one, and I'm sorry the other name is escaping me at the moment. But yeah, we've engaged with them over 5 times on this matter, and we so we've got all the detail there, and they say there's a pathway to 2030. But I must confess to you, they're not indicated that they're going to sell the fund. They're trying to sell the holding. They're trying to engage with the company to get them to work on their tar sands exposure.
So do you have any targets if they haven't got rid of this tar sand exposure? Then what's going to be?
So we because we don't have an exclusion policy, we can't make them sell it. We can't make them. We don't have the ability to say, well, you need to sell it.
But you could sell the units in the Royal London.
Yeah, we could. We could sell Royal London, but I think that might be a little extreme, Steve. Quite frankly. I mean,
because you're trying to
ultimate sanction.
Yeah.
Because that would be the ultimate sanction. But then who's
going to get rid of them? If they know that we're not going to get rid of them, then why would they?
Well, we set a responsible investment policy that they have to follow. So they will be engaging with the company. If the company doesn't meet the guidelines we've set, then they will have to sell it.
Right.
So there is an escalation. So they believe it's on a transition pathway and that it's going to reduce these companies are going to reduce their investments in these assets, etc. But as soon as it's clear that that's not going to happen, then they'll have to sell it under the broader RI guidelines we've issued.
And in terms of timescale, are we talking 1 or 2 years, or are we talking 7 years?
Oh, not 7, more like 1 or 2. In terms of, they just have to have a credible path.
Yeah.
You see, Royal London believes Suncor have got a credible path on tar sands.
So this is the heart of kind of the tension between making return and investing and your carbon footprint, because it may be that if Suncor, I don't know anything about the company, but Suncor holds these tar sands, it's got a poor reputation and it's quite a good value stock. Maybe I'm just speculating at the moment, but if it can transition successfully by 2030. Then you've gone from being a dirty company to being a clean company, and you'll probably go from having a low valuation to a high valuation, which will be a win in both respects, because we'll get rid of the tar sands and we'll make a return. So which is the ideal scenario.
Not ideal if it's by 2030. And the coal tar sands is the worst form, one of the worst forms.
No, we appreciate that.
For me, it's the credibility. So the credibility of the climate pathway of Royal London, did you say? And who's assessing whether that is credible? Because they're saying, yes, it's credible. It's in keeping with the current climate.
Yeah.
Now is going to do, I'm assuming they do their own assessment and will tell them, no, that's not credible.
Correct. Arlam are doing their own assessment, and our job is with our team to you know, put pressure on them to make sure they are doing their assessment. But if it's within our RI guidelines, there's nothing to stop them holding it. I mean, the alternative view is if you just divest from all this stuff and it all goes into private hands, you know, they'll probably keep running these assets for 20, 30, 40 years. So that you know that there's a whole debate to be had there around divestment versus. But I can assure you, we've had a lot of attention paid on these companies. Personally, I wish they hadn't bought them, because we've spent a lot of time talking to you know, clients about them. I can assure you there's a lot of engagement going on about them and regarding them, and if they really do have a net zero pathway.
And similarly, Royal London are engaging with Suncor as well. You know, we're engaging with Royal London, but Royal London are doing the same, and we're there on top of that as well. But as Steve touched on, and Tim, you know, they're on this pathway to reduce the carbon. But yeah, let's see. You know, as you say, tar sands are the worst. So yeah, you're quite correct there.
Anyone want to follow up on that or anything else?
Well, I'm just thinking whether I can maybe come, if we're going to be discussing climate in more detail in September, maybe if I can submit some questions for Brunel over the summer so they have time to prepare some answers. For September.
Yeah. I mean, that goes for anybody if you want to submit a question for future strategy or suggest. We're willing to do it. In learning more detail, then we're obviously open to hearing from your idea.
John's got a hand up.
Yes, Councillor Beasley.
Thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to make a quick couple of comments on this part of the discussion. And I just wanted to remind everybody that our position, as distinguished through, I think it was the Mercer report, was very much around our pursuit of the decarbonisation agenda rather than the disinvestment agenda. And we followed that through with Brunel. And so I'm satisfied from all I've heard and all I already knew that Brunel are following through in the way that we had intended. The second thing is that we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there's a huge amount of work being done, particularly by organisations such as the LAPFF, on all of these issues directly with companies, including visiting specific operations to test the data that's coming forward. So it isn't as though we're doing this at a complete distance. We're signed up to the LAPFF and they're doing, I think, a remarkable job in holding these companies to account and making sure that they're true and honest to what they're telling us they're doing and what they're intending to do. I'm assuming, obviously, that Brunel picked that work up as well from LAPFF. And I have to give credit, I think, to their chairman, Councillor McMurdo, who has done a terrific job in pushing this agenda. It doesn't get much profile, but it has a lot of effect. And I think we ought to bear that in mind, Chairman.
Indeed we will, I'm sure.
Thank you, John.
No, okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. Very helpful as always. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Right, we're going on to item 12 now, back to the main agenda. David, your
Thank you, Chairman. This is going to be very, very short and sweet, as I think a number of the items that I was going to pick up by others as we've gone through. So, but happy to take questions. So, the value of the fund's assets at the end of March 23 was 3.5 billion. That compares with 3.7 billion at the beginning of the financial year. So that gives you some kind of idea of the challenges that there have been through the financial year, even though we have seen that uptick, like in the final quarter of the year. As has been been mentioned several times actually, roughly 3/4 of those assets are now under the management of Brunel, and the main exceptions to that are our property investments. About a lot yesterday, and we'll talk about again later. And also, we also have some corporate bonds that are still outside of Brunel's management, and we have some legacy private and infrastructure managers that are outside of Brunel. I think Steve picked up on the performance figures when he did his presentation. So 3.2% versus 1.4 in the quarter to the end of March. But if you look at the overall return, yeah, so minus 4.8 to minus benchmark. Over the long period, annualized returns 3 years 9.1 compared to 9.3, and over 5 years 4.4. One of the things just to pick up is within the one of the recommendations is to do the final version of the funding strategy statement. So in March, we draft funding strategy statement to committee approval, publication for consultation, primarily with scheme employers. That consultation is now concluded, and there are no resulting changes to the strategy statement, and approved, publish that in the final version on the website. And that's about the answer.
Any questions? They're not all what they're letting off lightly.
In your report, the funding implications about value of the direct fossil fuel company. I'm really pleased to see that now updated at the directed one. Firstly, I'm just pleased that we've got that seems to have gone up with that. Yeah, just really to note that.
Yeah, regular report. Yeah, so two things on that. One is that we now have actually now provided the way the figures were calculated in the past was quite Robinson, if that's the right terminology. Lots of looking at different schedules, working out percentages, applying them to our numbers, etc., etc. What Brunel have very recently put in place is what we describe as a look through in terms of all of our investments, a schedule by industry. So what used to take, probably a day's worth of work and probably not particularly accurate is now much quicker piece of work. So we've got a higher degree of accuracy, I would say, in terms of the figures that we have there. Also, the thing to know is that that we reallocated more money into equities. So you'll recall when we took the decision to divest from LDI in November, 7.5% of that investment was then put into equities. So we've now got a bigger exposure to equities altogether. And also the value of those companies that are primarily involved in those areas, value of those companies has soared, as we've heard, over the last year. So it is a slight hammer to crack a nut, including that in there. And I think one of the things that we probably need to do is look at more at the carbon footprint of the fund overall. We have lots of information in the Brunel report. I think there's probably still a step to go where that information is summarised and look through at the whole of the pension funds investments. So yes, that's where we have to get change. I think it's worth putting it into perspective in terms of the overall value of the fund at 3 billion. The actual amounts that we're seeing now still.
I think it's just because it's one of those headline things. I do take the point that investments we had 2 years ago may not have changed whatsoever. Purely value of those investments has rocketed because of. So yeah, it might actually be might be the same event. Now managed at 66 as well as I think. So it's not that we're actively investing in.
No, but also as Councillor Beasley, not got a policy of divesting them, so we're not. It's not a case that we are zero from that. We're looking to reduce the carbon footprint of the investment. As well.
And also, I think another discussion was that the fund currently has a higher exposure to stocks than the growth. So, short term, it's not as now. I think operating long term, used so we've been ways of doing that for management. Zero behind that.
No, it can wait till September.
Great. We're all happy with that, and okay, we'll move on to dates for meetings. Sorry, I'll just double check that we oh yeah, recommendations, and we publish the yeah. We'll have the fund. Yeah, thank you very much. Yes. No, thank you very much. Right, then we have the dates. As I said, our next meeting is actually 19th, which is the day before Brunel, which they referred to. And somebody raised an issue about the date in March.
I just pointed out that it's Easter. That is the Tuesday running up to Good Friday. I wondered whether people noticed that.
You might want to that. I don't know.
I'm happy to look at it.
Yeah.
Forward to the weekend.
Something like that. Yeah. Look at it. Yeah. Normally it's sort of 12th of March or something like that.
Well, I know they don't like to change the meeting dates for the year ahead once they've been set in stone, but
I'm just thinking it's school holidays and things. Yeah. Sorry?
Out with school holidays.
Yeah. It's just with a question with but yes,
yeah, one thing that we haven't got now is a date for training. So there's talked a lot yesterday about trying to get that 19th September meeting. That's doable.
Yeah. It feels like, I mean, I sent an email to you first thing this morning on that because it feels like getting a training day the day before the committee meeting in September. There's a Brunel Investor training day the day afterwards. It's going to be a bit heavy, and that actually the training the day before might be the day before December rather than the day before September. The day before November rather than the day before September, as a suggestion. But it seems to me like there's quite a lot on the agenda that we've got to get through, and the actual committee meetings, are quite congested. We're just talking about RI, there's affordable housing, there's a follow-up on the equity side. So I think we need to sit down and have a little plan. And we have 2 or 3 meetings.
Yes, we probably 20 days for both.
Yeah.
Either or.
But do you want to do 3 days on the top?
Personally, I think the Brunel thing on the day after our meeting is less significant. There's minutes afterwards anyway. We were already making the decision. So
Okay.
you know, I would rather be sure that if like right, more than enough to stop us talk about arrange that. And I suspect that whichever date we choose to go for the stuff about zero and net policy and attract a lot of public interest. We have to respond. So I don't really see what they have your need to put off there. Which is advising to do the information.
But just to confirm, but there might be a Dorset training day the day before the September committee and the day before the December committee. November, sorry. Yeah, November.
It doesn't have to be the day before.
No, it doesn't.
In some cases, it's Councillor Legs also raised his preference that he had a training and
I prefer training in the morning and a committee meeting in the afternoon, which when we're in London is more or less what we do when we've gone to London for training sometimes. Not always. We've sometimes trained the day before and had a meeting in the morning, I know.
And then there's a consideration that if there's something at the committee meeting that needs to be decided that's contingent on the training, then the papers, that creates a problem for the officers to present the papers 7 days in advance. So I don't know. There's a few things need to be thought about there.
Yeah. But I think if we commit ourselves to what we're trying to achieve, then it gives enough time to start now to actually organise it properly and make sure.
I do find training days are very useful, whether we're held here or whether we used to hold them in London at managers. Just how they live their life was quite interesting, just walking through the door.
Okay. Thank you. Then moving on to move exempt business, please. You